I am 76 years old, and my days begin the way my father's did when he was that age, slow and particular, with the small dignities lined up in a row, like screws in a jelly jar. I shuffle to the kitchen before the sun has climbed over the cottonwoods, fill the kettle, wait for the whistle, and count out the grounds the way Elaine taught me when we were a young couple pinching pennies and pretending instant coffee could pass. For the real thing. The mug I use is chipped where my thumb sits. The radio on the windowsill mumbles weather and farm reports out of habit more than need. And on the fridge there's a floating magnet from the VFW fish fry we used to attend every Lent. The one where she would scold me for over-salting and then sneak an extra shake herself. After I rinse the cup and set it upside down on the towel, I touch the photograph of her that leans against the spice rack. Not because I am superstitious, but because the pad of my finger still remembers the warmth of her cheek. And if I do not remind myself that warmth once existed, I start to talk like a man who has only ghosts for company. Then I take my cane, not because I need it for every step, but because on the days when my knees forget their duty, it spares me the indignity of the floor, and I make the small procession through the house to the garage, whose door sticks on humid mornings and whose concrete remembers every winter. The garage is my chapel and my courthouse and my last honest employer. It smells of oil, hot dust, cedar shavings, and the leather of old work gloves that have learned the shape of my hands. I keep a peg board on the back wall with chalk outlines of the wrenches like a crime scene. Not because I am fussy, but because I learned long ago that the first step to fixing anything is being able to lay your hands on the right tool without a fuss or a prayer. Coffee cans filled with bolts sit labeled in my block letters. Blades hang sharpened and oiled, and on the far shelf there is a wooden box with a sliding lid that holds what my grandchildren once called Grandpa's treasures, which means an odd collection of things too useful to throw away and too stubborn to fit anywhere else. The light through the high window falls in a square on the bench around mid-morning, and I try to time my tasks so I am standing in that square when it arrives. There is something about working in warm light that makes a man forget his age for a blessed hour. Out on the driveway, the mailbox leans a little to the left because frost heaves never lift and settle the same way twice. And beyond it, the street in our Maple Grove cul-de-sac curves like a question mark, lined with ranch houses that once swarmed with tricycles and now whisper with sprinklers and dog walkers and the muffled clatter of Amazon vans. The neighbors wave. They know I can still change a mower blade, mend a fence panel, and coax a stubborn snowblower back to life with a length of wire, a blowtorch, and language my late wife would not endorse. It is quiet until it isn't, and the shift usually happens when my daughter's SUV rolls up on Saturdays as if an obligation had a schedule and a turn radius. Laura's 49 and tidy, the kind of tidy that clicks when it walks. And when she steps into my kitchen, she brings the breeze of her perfume and the clipped phrases of a woman who never knows where her mind will spend its next hour because somebody's calendar has already spent it for her. She kisses my cheek the way you pat a dog you don't want to love, calls me Dad in a voice that is more announcement than greeting, and then gets down to it. The new insurance deductible, the college balance for Mason's junior year, the sorority fees, for Lily's Rush events, the water heater that chose a bad week to fail, the fundraiser table that would look better if it were full. Her husband, Gavin, comes less often because engineers prefer problems that hold still, and old men do not. But when he does, it is with a project list he has prepared for me like a foreman handing out clipboards. Measure the crawl space humidity, inspect the deck footings, tighten the garage door, springs, nothing too heavy, he says, just the things you like to tinker with. And he says it with a smile that leaves a film on everything it touches. Last summer they began storing their off-season decorations and a spare set of tires in my garage, because their development's HOA doesn't like clutter. I said yes because saying yes to your child is a muscle you flex long after it has stopped being. Good for you. The tires sit like 4 fat waiting rooms, and behind them there is a second car they keep on my property to save space in theirs. The battery tender humming like a mild accusation. I am not blind to the arrangement. They have keys to my house because once, when I spent a night in the ER for an observation that meant nothing, the cat needed feeding. I have keys to everything else because old men with garages and time learn to keep duplicates the way sailors keep rope, out of sight until storms remind you what knots are for. When Elaine died 5 years ago, I thought grief would carve its channel and then the water would settle. But it turns out grief likes to wander and eat new banks. It finds a new corner of the house to flood, just when you have learned to keep your socks warm and dry. In those early months, Laura came often and cried in my kitchen and promised I would not be alone. And I believed her because it is a good thing to believe your child when they swear their love has a backbone, and because I was an accountant for 41 years, and numbers will trick you into thinking the columns of a life add up if you check them twice. Time did what time does. Smoothed the knife, dulled the memory, turned casseroles to leftovers and then to smells you could not place. And the visits thinned to texts with ellipses that never resolved, then to requests dressed as concern, then to advice about assisted living brochures that arrived in glossy stacks with cheerful strangers on the cover who looked like actors waiting to go back to their real lives. The first time Laura suggested I sell the house while the market was hot, she hid her eyes behind compassion and told me it would be safer to be somewhere with a nurse on every floor. The last time she brought a notary without asking, and Gavin stood at my counter with spreadsheets about property taxes and deferred maintenance and the attrition of widowers, and I told them to leave the papers where they lay, because the pen in my hand would not be used that way. We got through that afternoon like a family does when everyone is pretending they are not angry, with a polite clatter of cups and the slow war of breaths and a hug at the door that felt like a receipt. Paid in full, no returns. In between those episodes, I wrote checks because that is how I was raised, to step into the gap and hold it open a minute longer. When Mason needed a car that wouldn't die on the shoulder of I-94, I helped with the down payment. When their furnace coughed itself into a corner in January, I paid the difference between sensible and top of the line because rebates. When Gavin's bridge project ran long and their cushion ran thin, I sent just until the reimbursements clear. And no one mentioned that reimbursements sometimes live in the same room as unicorns. I am not a fool, though I know the expression on my face has become a kind of permission slip for people in a hurry. My hands still balance a level by feel. My mind still divides 16 inches on center without a calculator. And my memory, though it swims sometimes when I stand up too fast, still holds the map of this family's roads, including the cul-de-sacs, where apologies go to nap. In the evenings, when the neighborhood softens and the ball game on the radio agrees to keep me company without insisting on conversation, I sit at the workbench and sort keys. There is a ring for the house and shed and the old Ford, another for the safety deposit box, another for the padlocks that guard nothing anyone else values. And then there is a shallow drawer with a felt liner where I keep the misfits, the duplicates. I have cut over the years because I have lived long enough to know that a locked door is only a dare. I polish the brass with a rag that has become a diary of fingerprints, and I label them with a steady hand. And as I do it, I talk, not to Elaine exactly, but to the part of me that is still married to the idea of a promise kept. I tell that part the truth, that I am not ready to move anywhere with Bingo on Wednesday, that I am not senile, however convenient the rumor may be, that my daughter's impatience comes from fear and her husband's from pride, and neither has anything to do with the man I am when the garage door's down, that when they say I am forgetful, They mean I refuse to forget that I built a life with a woman who trusted me to tighten bolts until the timbers sang, that their storage boxes creep further into my space each month the way ivy creeps around brick, and then one day you wake to find your house is an apology. And that, God help me, I am still soft enough to feel guilty for resenting it. Some nights, when the wind runs its knuckles down the clapboard and the hanging cords hum, I hear the small creak of the house learning my weight again as I cross the threshold, and I understand with a clarity that does not ask permission that there are two kinds of old men in this world, the kind who step aside and the kind who stand their ground, and I have been both in my time, but I do not intend to be stepped over. It is possible that all of this sounds self-important coming from a man who has more time than tasks and more memories than company. But I take seriously the job of being the last witness to an ordinary life, and I am careful with the evidence. The title to the house sits where it should. The truck's registration is in a folder no one else would think to open. The bank accounts are reconciled with a pencil because ink is a kind of arrogance, and the names on the emergency contact list are the ones I have chosen, not the ones others would prefer. On Sundays, I still go to the 8 o'clock service and stand stubbornly through the hymns, because the body remembers the posture it held in joy. And afterward, I shake hands in the narthex and lie politely to people who ask how I'm doing, because the truth would make them late for brunch. When I come home, I peel off the jacket, hang it on the same nail it has hung on since Reagan, and walk back into the garage to breathe in the one room where nobody rearranges me. If you had asked me a year ago what I feared most, I would have told you the quiet, the long slope of afternoon where the only thing moving is the second hand. But I have learned that there is something worse than quiet, and that is the sound of your own child telling you what you are now allowed to be. I hear that sound even when she is not here, because words like safety and care and what's best can hang in the rafters like cobwebs. I brush at them with the long handle of a push broom and watch the dust float through the light. And I think about keys, about how they are small and stubborn and unglamorous, and about how they don't so much open doors as remind you that a door has two sides and you are standing on one of them by choice. I have a feeling, call it superstition, call it the arithmetic of a long marriage and a longer grief, that soon I will be asked to step through a door I did not choose. If that day comes, I will walk the perimeter of the room the way I have walked the perimeter of every problem I ever fixed. I will measure twice and cut once. And if someone thinks to turn the lock behind me, well, I have been careful all my life in small ways that look like nothing, and gentlemen with careful habits tend to have what they need when the lights go out. I had known for some time that my place in my daughter's household had shifted from something resembling family to something closer to an inconvenience that everyone endured, because they had not yet found a legal pretext to remove me. That truth lingered in the silences during our Sunday dinners, in the quick glances exchanged between Laura and her husband when I asked a question twice, in the way they spoke of plans, without ever naming me as part of them. Yet even with that awareness growing heavier in my chest, I was not prepared for the moment when Gavin, after a quarrel over nothing more than where the spare tools belonged, pressed his palm against my shoulder and herded me toward the garage as if I were a child sent to bed without supper. I thought he meant only to cool the air between us, but when the door closed behind me with the sharp click of a lock turned from the other side, I understood that something more deliberate had been set in motion. The thin panel of painted wood separated me from the warmth of the house, from my chair at the table, from the photograph of my wife resting by the window, and in that instant I realized they had decided I no longer belonged among the living rhythms of their home. I was to be stored away like seasonal clutter, hidden where I could not disturb the neatness of their lives. At first there was disbelief, a kind of stunned silence inside me that refused to accept what my ears had heard. the unmistakable sound of a bolt sliding home. I tapped lightly on the door, certain it was some mistake, that Laura would return within minutes with an apology and a forced smile, blaming Gavin's heavy hand or the trick of an old door that sometimes stuck. But the minutes stretched, the silence remained, and the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the corner and the faint scuff of tires leaving the driveway. My own daughter had not argued, had not insisted I come back inside, had not even spared me the courtesy of hesitation. The humiliation of it seeped slowly into me, heavier than anger, because anger at least allows a man to feel alive, while humiliation has the taste of rot, of something discarded and left to spoil. I looked around the garage where I had spent countless hours repairing what others had deemed beyond repair, and I saw it now as they must have seen it. Cluttered, dusty, half-lit, smelling of oil and rust. To them, it was the perfect holding cell, a place where an old man could be tucked away without witnesses, his dignity stripped as efficiently as the paint from a rusted fender. I sat on the stool by the workbench, my knees trembling, and asked myself whether this was the natural end of things, whether all fathers eventually become burdens to be stored rather than men to be respected. My mind traveled back to Elaine's warnings whispered years earlier, that Laura's practicality carried a sharp edge, that Gavin's politeness was only ever the skin of ambition stretched thin. I had brushed her words aside then, clinging to the hope that love between a father and daughter was stronger than calculation. Yet sitting there in the half-dark, the truth of her fears pressed down on me with suffocating clarity. Time moved strangely in that locked space. I do not know if it was an hour or 3 before I noticed what else had changed. Drawers left ajar, the folder where I kept old deeds and bank statements missing from the shelf where I had always placed it. Someone had already been rummaging through my belongings, quietly, like a thief who believes the house is empty. My heart tightened in my chest, because I understood then that this lock was not a flare of temper, not a passing punishment, but part of something colder and more organized.
They wanted me out of the way while they shifted papers, while they built a narrative of incompetence and senility around me.
The realization was like ice water poured over the back of my neck, because I had seen such schemes in other families during my working years. When aging clients found themselves maneuvered out of their own property by children who spoke of love. While drawing up legal papers that told another story, I had pitied those men once. Now I had joined their ranks. I rose slowly, my joints protesting, and paced the perimeter of the garage like a prisoner testing the walls of his cell. The air smelled of rubber and gasoline, and every object seemed to watch me with mute indifference. The lawnmower whose spark plug I had replaced, the rake with its handle worn smooth by my grip, the pegboard with its chalk outlines that no one else had cared to follow. These were the companions of my last honest years, and now they were my only witnesses. I tried the door again, rattling the knob until the metal rang out in the stillness. But there was no response. I even called out, not in anger, but in a cracked plea. "Laura, let me back in." Yet the sound swallowed itself against the insulation, and no footsteps came. In that moment I felt myself reduced to something less than a man, treated not as a father or even as an annoyance, but as refuse, as a piece of household debris that could be stowed until trash day. The worst of it was not the lock, nor even the theft of my documents, but the knowledge that my own child had chosen silence instead of defense. She had not needed to turn the key herself. Her failure to protest was worse than action. It told me everything about the place I now occupied in her heart, an obligation, an inconvenience, a liability. I sat back down, covering my face with my hands, and for the first time since Elaine's death, I allowed myself to weep not out of grief for her absence, but out of grief for the daughter who still lived, yet had already abandoned me. The tears dried slowly, leaving behind a resolve that surprised me. They thought the lock had made me powerless, but they had forgotten something I had never forgotten in my years of meticulous caution. Every lock admits of a key, and I had always been a man who kept spares. I did not sit long with my hands over my face, because the habit of careful living is stronger than despair. And as the clock on the wall thudded out its slow seconds, I began to take inventory the way I always have when something breaks and has to be made whole again. And that meant starting with what I still controlled in that room and what they believed I did not. The first discovery was small but electric. The strip of blue painter's tape beneath the front lip of the workbench where, months earlier, after Gavin had joked about how scatterbrained I had become with remotes and spare keys, I had slid an old tin that once held peppermints and now held my insurance policy against other people's plans. My fingers found the tape's edge, lifted the dust-gritty metal, and inside lay the master key to my own back door, the duplicate to the side gate, the slim remote for the garage opener that Gavin thought he alone possessed, and the fob to the second SUV they had decided to store on my property because their HOA liked a clean driveway. Along with the keys, there was a folded card where I had scrawled phone numbers no one else remembered. My banker's direct line, the branch manager who still called, me Mr. Miller out of habit from the days I audited her father's feed store, and the attorney whose card Elaine had insisted I keep, whether I ever needed him or not. Holding those keys, cold and ridiculous in my palm, I felt my spine lengthen in the way a man's does when he remembers he is not helpless, and the humiliation in my chest began to separate into strands I could name. Anger, caution, a careful curiosity about which move they had chosen and which they feared I might make next. What I did not yet understand was how far they had already traveled without me. But the clues were everywhere if I allowed myself to see them with a bookkeeper's eye rather than a father's. Because the trash can held a torn sleeve from a certified mail envelope with my name, misspelled the way Laura always misspelled it when she filled out forms in a hurry, and the bench held a pen with the logo of a clinic I had never visited, and my own metal filing box, the one I had kept in a locked drawer and labeled with the dullest word I could think of, manuals, was open and lighter by the weight of whatever papers it had once held. I pried up the cardboard bottom of that drawer and found the hollow where I used to keep the deed copy and the durable power of attorney Elaine and I had signed for each other back when we were healthy enough to imagine catastrophe without believing. In it, and the hollow was empty. It was a clumsy theft, not because it left fingerprints, which paper always does, but because it revealed a contempt for me that cut deeper than the taking itself. They had assumed I would never notice, or that if I did, I would shrug and concede the point, because old men in their story lose track of what matters and surrender it without a fight. I stood very still, listening for the car, and what I heard instead was the soft rasp of the interior door as someone eased it open and slid a plate onto the concrete the way you feed a skittish animal. And then the door closed again, and the lock turned with that same metallic certainty. The plate held a piece of toast with peanut butter and the mug with the chipped rim already cooling. And on the napkin Laura had written, "Dad, please eat," with a heart she must have drawn without thinking. And I stared at it so long my eyes burned. Not from gratitude, but from the recognition that pity, once substituted for respect, becomes another instrument of control. I did not touch the plate. Instead, I pressed the remote hidden in my palm and watched with something like relief as the segmented door shuddered, paused, reconsidered, and then rolled up enough for me to stoop under it, because Gavin had forgotten that the opener still listened to anyone who knew the code, and I had programmed mine with the same 6 digits I had used since the Reagan years, numbers that belonged to me more than to the door. The afternoon light slapped the floor in a bright rectangle, and I stepped out into it, the way a swimmer breaks the surface after staying down longer than his body liked. I did not run to the house or shout accusations into the quiet street. Haste is for people who need witnesses, and I needed none. I walked the side path to the gate, used the key Laura did not know I had to slip into my own kitchen, and stood in the doorway long enough to hear their voices in the next room. It was not a fight, not even a discussion, but the clipped, rehearsed rhythm of two people performing a conversation for a third who was not present. And that third person revealed herself when Gavin put them on speaker, and the cool voice of a woman explained that emergency temporary guardianship could be expedited if there was a documented pattern of confusion and endangerment, such as leaving a stove on or wandering outside in inappropriate clothing, and that a cognitive screening appointment had been secured for Tuesday morning and transportation arranged through a partner service. And all that would be required was a signature acknowledging consent. Although in circumstances like these, consent could be inferred for the safety of the elder. Laura murmured assent and supplied phrases I had heard her practicing for years. Increasing forgetfulness, paranoia, unsafe judgments. And the woman assured her the packet would arrive by courier that evening and to call if I became escalated. I should have stormed in, snatched the phone, told the stranger on the line that the only thing escalated in that house was their greed. But I did not, because a lifetime of hearing the beat of numbers teaches a man where the rhythm will take him if he lunges at the wrong bar. Instead, I slid to the hallway closet and confirmed what I suspected. The lock set on the interior garage door had been replaced with a keyed knob, something one installs on a storage room or a rental, not on the door a father uses when he comes in from mowing, and on the shelf above the vacuum sat a stack of glossy brochures for facilities with names that sound like lakes and birds, but smell like Lysol and surrender. I moved through my own house like a careful thief, seeing the layout as if for the first time, noticing the small camera puck magnetized to the corner of a bookshelf and the motion sensor where no motion had ever needed sensing. And when I reached the bedroom that had been mine for 45 years, there was a new thinness to it. The drawers not quite as full, the papers reorganized in a way that was precise, but ignorant of what should go with what. I slid my grandfather's ledger from the bottom of the dresser, the same ledger where he once wrote down seed purchases, and later where I wrote the dates of insurance premiums, and finally the medications Elaine took in those last weeks. And between its pages, I had hidden a photocopy of every document that mattered to a life. The deed, the title to the truck, the bank account numbers, the letter Elaine wrote in her careful school teacher's hand, appointing me executor of her small estate, and expressing in sentences so plain they cannot be twisted that she trusted me and asked whoever read those lines to do the same. I slipped the ledger under my shirt and returned to the kitchen without letting my breath show in my shoulders. They were still on the call, still making their case, when a different humiliation arrived, casual and small, which is how these things always come. Laura posted a message to the family chat about a bit of a scare, saying I had grown agitated and needed to rest in the garage where the air was cooler, assuring the grandchildren that Grandpa was fine, but a little confused, adding a smiley face that tasted like chalk in my mouth. Within minutes, the phone blinked with the gentle condolences of people who wanted to care from far away. "Love you, Gramps. Hang in there." And attached to one was a short video Gavin had apparently recorded through the camera puck. A sliver of me, rattling the knob like a man trying to walk through a door he has forgotten how to use. I did not know then whether it had been sent to anyone else, to a doctor maybe, or to a caseworker's file. But I knew what it felt like to be turned into evidence against myself. That feeling, more than the lock or the loss of papers, moved the needle inside me from sorrow to an anger so clear it sharpened the edges of the room. I put the untouched toast in the sink so the plate would not testify to my compliance, opened the back door before anyone could see me, and returned to the garage's honest air because it was the one room left where my decisions were still my own. What followed was not a grand rebellion, but the first quiet choreography of reclaiming a life. The kind of sequence that looks like nothing until the final click when all the moves line up and the thing comes free. I pulled the second SUV forward by inches to break the habit the battery tender had been teaching it, slid the fob into my pocket because a car that never moves is a story no one bothers to check, and I made a careful list on the back of a shipping label of what could not wait until tomorrow. Retrieved the ledger's contents to the safe deposit box before the courier's packet arrived. Phoned the banker before Gavin learned a phrase like convenience signer. Call the attorney using the number. Taped to the tin, rather than the one in my phone that my daughter felt free to borrow when she helped me with updates. I was not yet ready to cut them off or to confront them in the clean, bright language of courtrooms. I was ready only to remove their hands from the levers they had begun to pull in my name. I heard the murmur of their voices behind the door, rising and falling in the safe certainty that I was where they had placed me, and I realized with a sudden, almost comic gratitude that they had given me the privacy they denied me by believing the lock had stripped me of capability. I took the remote again, timed the door's roll, with the breath of the street slipped out, and crossed the side yard to the fence, where I had hidden years ago a key box meant for emergencies, and I spun its code and lifted out the spare for the old Ford and the brass for the shed, and without quite meaning to, the tiny key to Laura's own mailbox, which I had copied when she first bought the house and forgot her own set on my counter for a week. I held that last one in my hand until it grew warm, then tucked it back, because whatever ugliness we had entered, I would not be the man who read his child's mail. It grew late, and the heat in the garage softened, and with the ledger hidden inside my jacket, I waited for the light to move off the floor and for the whisper of tires that meant they would leave for groceries or for a meeting where my name would be the subject before the coffee went cold, and when the opportunity opened, I walked out with the slow steadiness that keeps neighbors from asking questions, climbed into the Ford that still answered to me, and drove to the bank branch that remembers men like me by sight. On the way, I passed the clinic whose pen had been left on my bench and felt the cheap tug of fate in my gut. I pictured a waiting room where my own daughter would sit in leggings and kindness, while a woman with a clipboard asked me to subtract sevens until I became a story she could file. At the bank, the glass doors breathed cool over my face, and the manager, with the old habit, looked up from her desk with a start that she tried to hide, and I asked for the safe deposit room and laid the ledger on the table as if it were a living thing. I did not tell her everything. Not yet, because I wanted to speak once instead of a dozen times, and because an old man who walks into a bank with fire in his mouth is a scene, while an old man with a list is a client. I placed the copies in the box, closed it, and when I turned the key, I felt the first clean relief I had felt all day. On the way out, I asked her to make a note in my accounts that no courtesy changes would be accepted without my voice on the phone. No new names added for convenience, no mailing address adjustments, no online access resets by anyone but me. She nodded and said of course, and after a pause, asked if I was all right, and I told her the truth in a sentence that made sense to neither of us. They locked me in the garage, and I remembered where I kept my keys. Driving home, I rehearsed the lie I would tell if they noticed anything out of place, tested the sound of innocence in my throat. Yet beneath the rehearsal, another voice had begun to speak with a steadiness I had not heard since before Elaine died, and that voice did not plan apologies or excuses. It planned steps. How to make the house and the car and the accounts align with the fact that I was still here and still competent. How to prepare for the courier's packet with its language about safety. How to bring to the next conversation not just the weight of a father's disappointment, but the light, sharp edge of a man who knows the rules and intends to play them. When I turned onto our cul-de-sac, the SUVs were gone and the curtains were still, and I rolled the garage door up and parked the Ford as I always had. Let the door come down with its long exhale and set the keys in a place only my hand would think to reach. I looked once more at the plate on the bench, the toast now stiff, the napkin with its pleading heart, and I understood that pity is the first mass cruelty puts on, and that the moment I accepted a meal like that, I would have agreed to the story they wanted to tell. I dumped the toast, washed the mug, dried it, and lined it up on the shelf with the others. And in that small alignment, I felt the gears of my life catch again. They had locked me in the garage to make me small. I had come out with the keys to the doors they thought were theirs, and the first part of whatever came next had already begun. There comes a moment in every war, even the kind that happens behind closed doors and polite voices, when the balance tips and you know the fight is no longer about small humiliations, but about survival, about whether you will be permitted to remain the man you have always been or reduced to something less by people who believe they are entitled to your undoing. That moment arrived for me one humid evening when the air in the garage held the smell of gasoline and betrayal, and I overheard, clear as a sermon, the words that confirmed every suspicion that had been gnawing at me like a rat under the floorboards. Gavin was on the phone again, speaking in the measured tones he used for clients, when he wanted them to trust him without thinking too hard, and he said that the petition would be stronger if there were 2 or 3 incidents recorded by third parties, and that they already had one. The video of me rattling the locked door like a confused prisoner. And soon they would have another, because Laura had arranged for a friendly neighbor to drop by and find me disoriented. The words were spoken with the calm cruelty of a man discussing drywall estimates, but to me they sounded like a death sentence written in advance, because they meant my own daughter had agreed to manufacture evidence that I was incompetent. And once that evidence accumulated in the folders of strangers, I would be erased as surely as if they had buried me. I remember gripping the edge of the workbench so hard that the wood creaked, not because I was afraid, though I was, but because the fury rising in me needed something to bite into. In that instant, every small condescension, the chosen meals, the forced pills, the whispered corrections, took its rightful place as preparation for this larger act of dispossession. They were not careless. They were deliberate. I was not mistaken. I was being managed out of my own life. It struck me with the kind of clarity that does not fade, that my daughter no longer measured my worth by the years I had carried her or the nights I had worked late to keep food on the table, but by the legal instruments she could secure with my name stripped from them. I did not storm out then. A younger man might have, but age teaches that explosions burn themselves out quickly while silence sharpens like a blade. I waited, listening, and when Gavin ended the call and Laura came into the kitchen humming a tune she must have borrowed from the radio, I could hear in her voice a lightness that told me she felt safe, certain that I was too blind to see the net closing around me. That safety was her mistake, because I had already moved my copies of the deeds to the bank, already lined up the attorney's card with the phone numbers, already rehearsed in my mind what I would do when they thought I was trapped. Their arrogance had given me time, and I intended to use it. The breaking point, the true midpoint of this descent, came 2 days later when Laura sat across from me at the kitchen table with a smile so brittle it could have been carved from porcelain, and slid a document across the table. "It's just a medical consent form, Dad," she said, her voice sweet with the effort of persuasion. "For your next appointment. Standard practice. Nothing to worry about." The paper was thick, official-looking, its paragraphs dense with the kind of language ordinary people skip over. But I had spent a lifetime reading contracts, balancing books, catching the line items others preferred to skim. And I saw at once that it was no simple consent form, but a broad authorization for guardianship evaluations and release of medical records to third parties. Signing it would have meant handing them the knife they planned to use against me. I looked at her and asked quietly why she needed my consent for an appointment I had not made. For a second she faltered, her smile slipping. But then she reached for my hand, squeezed it, and said, "Because I want to take care of you, Dad. Because I love you." And in that moment, for the first time in my life, I recognized that love could be weaponized, could be spoken not as devotion, but as leverage, as if saying the word was enough to excuse the theft it accompanied. I pushed the paper back across the table and told her I would read it later. She tried to insist, Gavin's eyes watching me like a hawk's from the doorway. But I simply stood and walked to the garage, shutting the door between us like a judge ending the trial. Alone among my tools, I let the weight of what had happened press itself fully into me. My daughter had become my accuser, my jailer, and my executioner in waiting, and my son-in-law her accomplice. The house I had built into a refuge was now a staging ground for my removal. And yet, I still held the keys. In my pocket, the remote rested. In the drawer, the duplicates gleamed. In the bank, the ledger slept with its copies. They thought I was cornered, but they had mistaken silence for surrender. That evening, while the house was quiet and their car gone, I laid out every key, every document, every note I had hidden, and I saw, as if from above, the map of a counteroffensive. I would not wait to be declared incapable. I would strike first, with precision, with the patience of a man who has spent his life balancing ledgers. It was then, staring at the small brass teeth of the keys that could open doors they did not even remember existed, that I understood the turning point had arrived. There was no reconciliation left to hope for. No gentle path back to the family dinners I once dreamed of. They had crossed a line, and in crossing it, they had freed me of any illusion that I was still bound to them by anything other than blood. And blood, I realized, can be thinned to water when betrayal is poured into it long enough. The second half of my life, however long it might last, would not be spent waiting for their permission. It would be spent reclaiming what was mine and ensuring that when the story of my decline was written, it would not be in their handwriting. I woke the next morning with the sort of steadiness that follows a sleepless night, when a man has done all his crying in private and has nothing left but the plain mechanics of survival. And I began the day the way a bookkeeper opens a new ledger, not by listing hopes or injuries, but by entering the facts that will govern what comes next. And the first fact was that the door that had been locked against me now swung at my touch, because I had the remote and the duplicates and a patient willingness to move only when the sound from the other side told me I would not be seen. So I slipped out into the early light, drove the Ford to the bank, while the sprinklers along our street still hissed against the curbs, and asked for the manager, who remembers me from the days when clients brought ledgers in shoeboxes and my handwriting covered their margins. I told her without ornament that someone in my family was preparing a petition to take from me the right to sign my own name, and that I wanted to place every account under a lock that answered to my voice alone. And she listened with the sort of pity that can sting if you let it, then turned it into procedure by adding passwords that could not be guessed, notes that no change would be accepted without me present in the flesh, and a flag that would send an alert to her desk if anyone so much as asked to update an address. She showed me a screen of recent activity, and there it was, small as a tick on a hound, but just as hungry, a request made the previous afternoon to add a caregiver contact to my checking profile. It had been rejected for lack of documentation, but the attempt told me what I needed to know about the speed of the trap they were building. So I thanked her, slid the ledger copies into the safe deposit box, and asked for a printout I could carry to a lawyer when it came time to turn my fears into sworn statements. Back home, I did not meet them with speeches or accusations, because speeches serve people who want to be forgiven, and I had no intention of asking for anything from them but distance. Instead, I made a sandwich in my own kitchen, sat at my own table, and watched Laura study me the way a nurse studies a patient she intends to mark as pleasantly confused. And when she asked softly whether I had thought more about signing the consent, "So, we can help you, Dad," I said only that I always read what I sign, and that I would bring it to my attorney for review. And the way her mouth tightened told me I had missed my appointment with the script, where I nod and comply and let her shepherd me through doors I do not understand. Gavin arrived home early with a careful brightness in his voice, and a paper bag from a bakery that he set in front of me as if generosity might work where pressure had failed. And we made stilted conversation about the weather and the twins and the price of fuel oil until he drifted, as he always does, to the subject that carried the true weight of his worry. "We've been talking to someone who really understands these things," he said, eyes meeting mine, in the way a man checks a beam for load. "And it sounds like there are ways to make sure your house is managed responsibly as you get older, so no one takes advantage of you or lets things fall into disrepair," which would have sounded like concern if he had not been the very person who locked me where he could not see me and then filmed the evidence of my protest. I told him the house had stood through 40 winters without his management, and that it would stand through whatever was left of me. And then I excused myself to the garage because the air is cleaner there, even when it smells of gas and old wood. The escalation did not arrive as a bang, but as a sequence of petty efficiencies designed to produce a single conclusion. On the following afternoon, I heard Laura at the front door laughing too loudly with our neighbor, the sort of falsetto a person uses when she is auditioning for Concerned, and within minutes the neighbor's head appeared around the kitchen corner like a scout's, her eyes performing a quick inventory of an old man's competence. And Laura said in a voice that could have sold sympathy by the ounce that I had been resting in the garage because the house was warm, and would our sweet neighbor check on me while she ran to pick up groceries so she wouldn't worry. And I understood with the same clarity I used to feel when a column refused to reconcile that this, at last, was the staged incident Gavin had promised over the phone. Only the timing was theirs, and the script was not. The garage door stood half open because I had propped it with a length of scrap as insurance, and when Mrs. Kenner stepped in and found me not ranting, but sanding the edge of a cedar board with slow, long strokes, I looked up and greeted her by name and asked after her bad knee and the hydrangeas that had sulked all summer. And then, as if by accident, I gestured toward the interior door with its new keyed knob and the plate Laura had once slid in with toast and the mug I had not used. And I said, as gently as a man can say what he must without scaring the listener, that sometimes doors in old houses stick, and that it is a strange sort of sticking when a bolt turns from the outside. And I watched comprehension push across her face like dawn over a field. Slow at first, and then all at once. And she took out her phone not to call gossip, but to take 3 quiet photographs of the lock, of the plate, of the gap where the door jamb wood had been chewed by a hastily mounted strike plate. And she tucked the phone away without comment. We spoke then of small things for a respectful minute, and when Laura returned all kindness and keys, I thanked our neighbor for her visit, and saw in Laura's eyes a flash of panic that a witness had seen what was not meant to be seen, which is to say the truth uncurated by their narrative. That night, while the house slept the superficial sleep of people who mistake plans for certainty, I brought the second SUV to life with the fob they had forgotten I possessed, only long enough to wake the battery and to confirm the VIN against the registration I had copied years ago when Gavin asked me to co-sign for insurance reasons, and when the numbers matched and my name appeared in black and permanent ink, I felt a grim confirmation that the thing sitting in my garage like a red promise belonged to me as much as to him, and that meant it was leverage in a language he would not mistake. I did not roll it into the street or sell it that night, because fury makes poor contracts. But I did take photographs of the odometer and the plates and the VIN, and I printed them on my old inkjet, so there would exist evidence not subject to the disappearances that happened to phones and families under stress. I also gathered every envelope that bore my name and address, checked the return addresses, and found 2 surprises that tightened the knot of the story into something harder. A notice of a scheduled evaluation from a memory clinic across town I had never visited, addressed to me, but with Laura listed as primary contact, and a letter from a different bank, one I do not use, welcoming me to their online portal and inviting me to set a password for accounts I had not opened. That last letter tasted of panic and clumsy hands, the kind of misstep people make when they are rushing to turn air into paper. And by morning I was at an elder law attorney's desk laying out the pile like exhibits, telling the story without heat, which is how you make institutions listen. Her name was Marisol Kane, a woman younger than my daughter, but with eyes that reminded me of my wife's when she listened to a student explain why homework could not be done. She asked measured questions, slid a yellow pad toward me, and then sketched in neat loops the actions that would meet their actions where they lived, which is to say in filings and certified mail and polite, devastating letters. We would draft a revocation of any power of attorney they might try to wave around with my forged consent. We would execute a new healthcare proxy naming someone who had a conflict only with disease and not with my assets. My pastor agreed without hesitation when I called him from the lobby, and we would schedule an independent capacity evaluation conducted by a doctor whose practice did not share so much as a parking lot with the clinic on Laura's Pen. We would also file a simple police report about unlawful restraint, not because I believed a uniform would march up to my door and handcuff my son-in-law, but because even a modest report anchors a slippery story to a date and a badge number, and later, when courts read narratives about confused elders who wander, a report that says a door was locked from the outside becomes the stone that keeps the paper from blowing away. As Ms. Kane spoke, I felt the fog in my chest thin, not because anyone had promised victory, but because the fight had stepped out of the shadows where humiliation lives and onto a field with painted lines. The blowback, when it came, had the sour smell of desperation. Laura discovered within a day that the memory clinic had received a fax revoking her as primary contact, and she called me with a voice already wet with tears, demanding to know whether I had any idea how much she did for me, how hard it was to be the only child of a stubborn man who refused help, and whether I intended to punish her by involving outsiders who would twist our private family concerns into something ugly. I let her speak until the rehearsed phrases exhausted themselves. Then I told her in words, as even as I could manage, that any help that begins with a lock is not help but control, that any meeting about my mind that I am not invited to is not care but strategy, and that any consent I am asked to sign under the gaze of our man who locked me as one might lock a utility closet will not be given. She hung up with the kind of finality people practice when they are children, and within the hour Gavin arrived, not with the bakery bag, but with the heavy tread of a man who believes anger can be made into a crowbar, and he announced that they would be taking over the bills now for my own good, because I had raised red flags at the bank that embarrassed the family. I smiled the way an old dog smiles when a young one tries to steal his bone, and I reached into the drawer where I keep the keys and lifted the set to the red SUV by its ring, holding it up between us in the afternoon light. And I said only that before he talked to me about control, he should remember whose property he had parked in my care and whose name shared the title, and that if he preferred to discuss responsibility, we could do so downtown with Ms. Kane present, where words like abandonment and fraudulent misrepresentation do not sound like the vocabulary of a soap opera, but like counts on a sheet. He took a step forward and then stopped, because something in my face, perhaps the absence of fear, told him the game had changed. They did not quit. People like Gavin do not surrender to dignity, and people like Laura cannot bear to face what they have done without smearing it with fresh paint. They tried again through a back door I had left unguarded, calling my doctor to say I seemed confused, trying to move my mail to a P.O. box for security, even stopping the yard crew to inform them they should call his number for payment. But each move met my new habit of answering with paper, and by the end of the week there were receipts for every notice sent. A new mailbox lock, installed by my hand, that made a sweet, clean click, and a signed letter from my physician, a man who has watched me balance glucose and grief for a decade, stating that while I am old as dirt, I am as oriented as a compass and as capable of directing my care as any man he sees in clinic. I taped a copy of that letter to the inside of the cabinet where Elaine's tea used to sit, not because I needed reminding, but because I liked the idea that in my own house the truth could rest within easy reach. The most painful escalation was not legal, but personal, as these things always are. On a Sunday afternoon, Laura came alone, hair unwashed, eyes ringed, hands moving restlessly around the rim of a coffee mug. And she told me between shallow breaths that their finances were a hive, that the new house bled cash, and the twins were expensive, and the bonuses had not been what Gavin promised, and the bridge project had gone sideways, and his second car was leveraged in ways she did not understand, and that she had panicked when she realized I could ease all of it with a signature. And a sale if only I would accept the narrative she had composed about my decline. She said she had been scared and ashamed and had told herself it was a form of love to take control so I would not be hurt. And that sentence, more than any other, revealed the chasm between us, because in it, love was no longer a devotion to another's good, but a permission slip for whatever made her own fear quiet down. I told her I would not call the police that day, that I would not shame her at church or the VFW or the HOA meeting, that my vengeance, if such a thing exists, would be lit by a cooler fire. I would simply reassert custody over my life, and if the ripples of that assertion overturned her boat, it would be because she chose to tie it to mine after cutting my lines. I ended that week the way I had begun it, by laying out the keys on the workbench like small gold teeth gleaming under the window square of afternoon. And I understood that they were more than metal. They were the index of a life I had built, deliberately, where doors and responsibilities and names on titles reflected the slow labor of trust. And I understood also that Laura and Gavin had come to believe that trust was inertia, a thing that would continue even after they replaced my name with theirs, and in that misunderstanding they had given me a gift. They had underestimated a careful man. The second escalation did not look like a movie. There were no sirens, no shouts in the night, only the clean slide of papers into envelopes, the quiet arrival of a notary who witnessed my signatures as I revoked what could be twisted, the firm handshake of a pastor who agreed to step in if a hospital ever tried to hand my choices to anyone but me, the decisive click of a new deadbolt on the interior garage door that now opens from my side only, and the sight of the red SUV moved, not sold, yet, not stripped for parts or paraded as a trophy, but parked where the sun hits it on my driveway with a handwritten note under the wiper that says, "Title on file, Contact Counsel," a small flag planted on ground I had reclaimed. And because I am an old man who has learned that defeat sometimes wears the face of silence, I also set the smallest trap of all, a cheap camera hidden in the pegboard shadow, aimed at the lock, powered by a battery that lasts a month. It's feed. Stored on a card the size of a postage stamp, because I have accepted that people who will lock you in a garage will also, when desperate, try to prove you locked yourself there. And if the third act of this grim little play demanded another witness, I intended to provide one who never misremembers. By the time the week clicked shut like the lid of my tin, I could feel the ground under my feet leveled and tamped. Not because danger had passed, but because I had turned toward it with my hands full of the only tools that ever save a man in a family: war, documentation, patience, and the refusal to let humiliation dictate the tempo of his day. They had escalated in the way people do when they believe they are entitled to your surrender. I had escalated in the only way that works when you are too old to fight with fists and too proud to give up the roof you shingled with your own hands. I had taken the keys to everything they thought they owned about me, and I had locked what mattered where only my name would open it. It is one thing to live in suspicion, circling your own thoughts like a watchdog pacing the fence line. But it is another entirely to stand face to face with your betrayers when they finally realize the trap has snapped back on their own necks. The culmination of everything came one evening when Laura and Gavin arrived unannounced, not with the false sweetness of a visit, but with the hardness of people who believed they had been robbed, and they marched into my kitchen with the arrogance of owners instead of guests. Gavin's face was tight, his jaw clenched as though he were holding back a tide of curses, while Laura's eyes were ringed with fury and desperation, a daughter's mask long since stripped away to reveal only calculation. They had discovered what I had done. The accounts closed, the SUV sold, the documents filed, the house that they thought was theirs now tied up in a forced sale, and they demanded answers, demanded explanations, demanded obedience. But I was no longer the man who had sat silent in their garage, waiting for the sound of a key. I was a man with proof in his pocket, counsel at his back, and a calmness born of finally understanding that dignity is not something others grant you. It is something you decide not to surrender. They started with shouting, as cowards always do, throwing accusations like stones, saying I had betrayed them, that I had ruined their stability, that I was destroying the very family I claimed to love. I let them rage, not answering at first, letting the storm spend its energy against the walls of my house, because silence is sometimes the strongest weapon. But when Laura spat that word betrayal at me as though it were a knife she could twist, I lifted the keys, those same keys they had forgotten existed, and I told her that betrayal was locking your father in a garage like a stray animal. Betrayal was stealing his credit card. Betrayal was lying to neighbors about his mind falling, so you could strip him of the rights he had earned with decades of sweat and caution. My voice did not rise, but it cut, and for the first time I saw Gavin falter, if only for a second, because even liars recognize the truth when it is thrown like a stone through their own glass. Laura tried then the only tactic left to her. Tears, trembling lips, words of reconciliation. She said she had been afraid for me, that she had only wanted to make sure I was safe, that the signatures and guardianship papers were never about money, but about love. But I had lived too long to mistake manipulation for affection, and I answered with the documents I had prepared, the certified letters, the notarized revocations, the report from the doctor declaring me competent in every faculty. I laid them on the table like a hand of cards, and in that instant the power shifted fully. They could not shout down paper stamped by the court. They could not cry away signatures witnessed by strangers. Their empire of control collapsed under the weight of simple facts. Yet the climax was not in their defeat, but in my choice. Gavin leaned across the table, eyes burning, and hissed that they would contest every move, that I would die alone without family, that my grandchildren would never know me, that all my years of sacrifice would end in silence. And Laura, her face twisted with a hatred she could no longer mask, whispered that even her mother had pitied me, that Lavinia had confessed to her regrets in marrying me, that I had been a cold and distant man. That was the cruelest blow, meant to pierce the only armor I had left, the memory of the woman I loved more than life. For a moment the room spun, my chest ached, and I nearly believed it. But then I saw the satisfaction flicker in her expression, and I understood. These were not truths. They were weapons fashioned in desperation. Lavinia had loved me. I had carried her laughter in every corner of this house, in every routine of my mornings, and I would not allow my daughter's lies to be the final word on my marriage. So I stood, slow but steady, and I told them they would have nothing more from me. No money, no keys, no forgiveness. They were free to rage, free to curse, free to threaten, but they were no longer free to touch any part of my life. I ordered them out of my house. Gavin sneered, expecting me to falter, but when I pointed calmly to the door and reminded him that a police report already bore his name for unlawful restraint, he saw that I was ready to call that number again, and he backed away. Laura lingered, tears streaking her face, her mouth working as if to form some final plea. But I turned from her. The door closed with a hollow sound behind them, and with it went the last fragile tie between us. The house fell silent after their departure, but it was not the silence of exile. It was the silence of a battlefield after victory, when the smoke clears and you realize you are still standing. I looked around at the small kitchen, at the faded photographs, at the tools on my bench, and I felt not triumph, but a strange kind of peace. They had tried to bury me under humiliation and control, but in the end I had buried their schemes under the simple truth that I still held the keys, both literal and figurative, to my own life. That was the climax, not their collapse, but my reclamation of the one thing they could never steal unless I gave it away. My dignity. I did not expect happiness to return with a fanfare. It came back the way a good tool fits the hand after years of disuse, quiet and exact. And if there was a banner at all, it was the curtain of light that opens across the lake each morning while the kettle rattles and the radio mumbles the farm report to a man who no longer has a farm but still likes the cadence. In the new apartment I hung a small pegboard on one wall. Nothing grand. Just enough to hold the wrenches and the stubby screwdrivers and the square whose nicked edge I could identify by touch. Beside it sits the photograph of Elaine and a coffee mug she chose at a church rummage. And when I rinse that mug and set it to dry, I feel the same small click of rightness I used to feel when a ledger balanced on the first try. The court order arrived. Signatures and seals and language that makes people like my son-in-law sit down whether they feel like it or not. And with it, the sale closed, the proceeds divided, and the last of the accounts shifted under locks that answer only to my voice. The red SUV is someone else's monthly payment now. My mailbox opens to a key that has never left my pocket, and the interior door between my kitchen and the little workroom is fitted with a simple latch. Nothing punitive, only a reminder that doors are the punctuation of a life, and I am entitled to choose where the commas go and where the final period lands. I met with Ms. Kane one last time and signed the living trust that gives away my money, the way I believe money should travel when a man is done with it. A scholarship in Elaine's name for kids who take shop instead of calculus and need steel-toed boots more than laptops. A line for the church pantry that fed 3 embarrassed fathers I remember from my working years. And a provision for the grandchildren that pays out when they are old enough to know that love is work and not a debit card. Their parents. Names do not appear anywhere in the document, and that is not vengeance. It is accounting. On Sundays, I still stand through the hymn, knees like old hinges, but steady. and after the benediction, I walk around the lake, not fast, not slow, and I notice small things I had forgotten to notice. A boy teaching his sister to throw bread in an ark. To gulls without hitting anyone. A woman with a limp who still keeps pace with her dog. The particular green the water turns under a sky that can't make up its mind. Sometimes the neighbor kid, Luis, knocks with a busted chain or a wheel that refuses to true. And I roll a stool out onto the breezeway and we talk while we work. Because bicycles, like old men, make more sense when they're in motion. When we finish, I hand him a rag, and he leaves a muddy handshake on it that I do not wash out, because it is proof that a thing passed from one set of hands to another. Word got around the building, and now 2 widowers bring me wobbly chairs, and a nurse from the 3rd floor asked if I could look at the latch on her balcony door. I accept cash only when someone insists, and even then I fold it into the church. Envelope because my rent is paid a year ahead, and my pantry is full of the plain good things a man eats when he is done. Being polite to people who want to starve him of himself. As for Laura, time has not turned her into a stranger, only into a woman I no longer recognize as mine. Twice I have seen her across a parking lot, and both times the air between us felt like glass. Not thick enough to stop a voice, but thick enough to distort it. I do not hate her. Hate would keep me knotted to a rope I have already untied. Once I wrote her a letter that said only this: when you are ready to speak to me alone, without scripts or witnesses or the language of management, my door will open, and if you cannot do that, then leave me to the quiet I have earned. And I sealed it, and walked to the mailbox and stood there long enough to hear Elaine clear her throat, the way she did when I was about to say something I could not take back. And I tore the letter in half, and then in half again, and watched the pieces settle in the bin like snow. The grandchildren sent a note through the pastor. Not an apology, not quite a bridge, only a short message in uneven sentences that sounded like youth when it is not being coached. I replied with the dates of the scholarship in their grandmothers, name and the address of the apartment, and I added that if they ever want to learn how to fix a chain or change a tire or balance a checkbook without cursing, I have a stool and an afternoon and a tin of cookies, and if they never come, that will be all right too, because an invitation is not a debt. In the evenings, when the light slides down the wall and the lake throws back the last bright coins of day, I open the tin that used to hold peppermints and now holds the keys that saved me. Copy to the back door, spare to the shed that is no longer mine. The fob to a car I no longer own. The brass to a mailbox whose lock I changed the week I chose myself. And I lay them out on a cloth, not to gloat, but to remember that care is a habit that can be taught to courage, the way a hand teaches a glove. Its shape. I will not pretend there is no ache. There is, and it wakes me sometimes at 3 a.m, when the building's pipes tick in their sleep, and the memory of my daughter's voice returns with its cutting edges. And on those nights I make tea, and touch the photograph and say out loud the things I wish I had said when we were all still soft with trusting each other. Then I put the cup in the sink, set it upside down to dry, and go back to bed. Because the morning will ask me for ordinary bravery again, and I intend to give it. If you ask me what victory looks like for a man like me, I would point not to the balance in a bank or the letterhead on a legal order, but to the small particular freedoms that have returned. The pleasure of choosing fish over pasta without anyone correcting me. The satisfaction of leaving the house by the door I prefer. The humor in knowing I own nothing that owns me back. Sometimes I take one of the old blank keys I never cut and hold it against the evening window. It throws a little shadow that looks like a flag, and I think that is what I carried out of that garage the day they tried to make me into something. Disposable, a flag of the smallest republic in the world, the one a man governs when he refuses to be locked away. I have placed a nail by the door, and on it hangs a single key on a leather thong. It opens only this home, only this life. And when I step out to the breezeway and breathe the lake air, I touch it like a benediction. Then I turn the lock behind me, not to keep anyone out, but to remind myself with the solid click that I am the steward of what remains. And that is more than enough.